My name is Dr. David Grummitt. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the History of Parliament Trust. I've published extensively on the reign of Henry VII, and my book, Henry VII, the First Tudor King, was published by the Davenant Press in 2008. Today I'm going to be addressing the question of how serious a threat were the Yorkists to Henry VII. This is a slightly odd question because the Yorkists, in fact, are an invention of modern-day historians. The Yorkists properly, of course, are the kings Edward IV, Edward V and Richard III. And seeing as all of them were probably dead at the beginning of Henry VII's reign, they wouldn't have posed much of a threat. But what today I'm going to be talking about are the group of various dissident landowners, old supporters of Richard III, and various other people who historians have grouped together under the name the Yorkists, and these men were behind the various plots and pretenders that Henry faced during his reign. Few kings can have come to the English throne with so slim a claim as Henry VII. His claim to the English throne was derived principally through his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. The Beauforts, of course, were the illegitimate offspring of John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son, and Catherine Swynford. The Beaufort children had been legitimised by Richard II in an Act of Parliament of 1397, and in 1407 Henry IV, Gaunt's son and the first Lancastrian king, further confirmed their legitimacy. Significantly, in 1407 Henry IV actually debarred them from the throne. So the Beauforts could not succeed to the throne, although their legitimateness and their ability to accede to lands was in fact confirmed. In any event, Henry VII was not the only claimant to the throne descended from the Gaunt-Swynford union. The mother of Edward IV was Cecily Neville, who was the daughter of Joan Beaufort, the only daughter from the Beaufort line. So the claim that Henry VII made was in fact weaker in all respects than that of the Yorkist kings. Henry's father, of course, was descended from the union of Owen Tudor to Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow. This again was an entirely spurious claim to the English throne. When Henry became king then, in August 1485, he did so by right of conquest. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, soon after his winning at Bosworth, was an attempt to unify the houses of Lancaster and York and to give a further legitimacy to his reign. But principally, Henry was king because the political nation wanted him to, and it was a claim that was vindicated by his victory at Bosworth. That said, the Yorkist claimants to the throne were more numerous and had better claims on paper than Henry Tudor. First of these, of course, was Edward V, one of the princes in the Tower and the eldest son of Edward IV. Rumours persisted about Edward and his brother Richard, Duke of York, throughout the first years of Henry's reign. Henry couldn't really claim or show that they were dead, although they had probably been killed during the reign of their uncle, Richard III. The most serious pretender was, of course, Perkin Warbeck. Perkin Warbeck pretended to be Richard, Duke of York, second son of Edward IV. Warbeck was backed by his aunt, Margaret of Burgundy, and eventually by Maximilian, the King of the Romans, and by James IV, King of Scotland. Warbeck was a serious threat to Henry VII because, if nothing else, he had the support of these powerful European princes. In 1492, Warbeck emerged on the scene almost as if from nowhere, getting recognition at the court of Margaret of Burgundy. He attempted to land at Deal in Kent in 1495, but was forced to retreat when the levies of the Shire of Kent basically turned up on the beach and stopped him from landing. From there, Warbeck went to Scotland, where he was welcomed by James IV. Warbeck was clearly a pawn in European politics at this time, but this didn't in fact make him any less of a threat. In 1496, the Scottish king, James IV, invaded England on behalf of Warbeck, and in 1497, Cornish rebels rose in a rebellion which was really sparked by tax, their resistance to paying the taxes that Henry had attempted to raise to pay for the Scottish War. They marched on Blackheath and in June 1497 were defeated by the king's forces. Warbeck, unfortunately, landed in England too late to be part of this rebellion, and soon afterwards, in the summer of 1497, he was forced to surrender to Henry. He was not put to death straight away, but was imprisoned in the Tower. The second Yorkist pretender, in terms of the threat posed, but the first in terms of chronology, was of course Lambert Simnel. Simnel claimed to be the Earl of Warwick, Edward, Earl of Warwick, who was the Duke of Clarence's son, and thus Edward IV's nephew. In March 1487, Simnel appeared in Ireland, supported by the Earls of Desmond and Kildare. Richard III's erstwhile supporters, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, and Francis Viscount Lovell, travelled to Ireland in support of him and landed in Lancashire at the head of an army which was comprised mainly of Irish clansmen and Burgundian mercenaries. On the 16th of June 1487, Simnel and his ragtag army met Henry VII's forces at Stoke, near Newark, in Nottinghamshire. The battle ended in ignominious defeat for Simnel. Lincoln was killed, Viscount Lovell disappeared, and Simnel, really a measure of the threat that he posed to Henry VII, was not even imprisoned, but was actually put to work in the king's kitchens. I think the fact that Simnel was not really treated seriously shows us the level of support and the real measure of the threat that his rebellion posed to Henry VII. One of the main reasons that Simnel's rebellion proved so inconsequential was the fact that the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, was a prisoner in the Tower of London. It was very easy for Henry VII to point to this fact and to actually display the real Warwick to prevent or to dissuade people from joining Simnel's rebellion. Warwick himself probably had the best claim to the English throne after the death of the princes in the Tower sometime between 1483 and 1485. But Warwick was allowed to languish in the Tower of London until 1499. In that year, he made an ill-advised escape attempt and was implicated in further plots that also involved Perkin Warbeck. So in 1499, both Warwick and Warbeck were executed by the king. Other Yorkist plots came from those who were close to the old king, Richard III. These actions were really the rebellions of desperate men. In 1485 and 1486 there were risings in the north of England on behalf of those men who had previously served Richard III. Early in 1486, Humphrey Stafford of Grafton attempted to raise a rebellion in Worcestershire in the name of Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick. This rebellion fizzled out as soon as the king put troops on the road. In the same year, Francis Viscount Lovell, one of Richard III's closest supporters, attempted to raise the old Neville affinity in Middleham in Yorkshire. Again, as soon as the king mustered his forces and began to march against the rebels really dissipated and Lovell was forced into exile, only again to appear the following year in support of Simnel. More serious than these threats posed by disaffected ex-Yorkists were the plots within the king's own household. Henry's household, of course, was the centre of his government and of his political power. It was the place where the king should have enjoyed the loyalty of all those men who had sworn personal oaths of loyalty to him. During the Parliament of 1487, there emerged rumours of plots to murder divers great officers of the king's household. The circumstances of these plots are very mysterious. Little is known about them other than a few chance references in chronicles and, of course, the Act of Parliament. One of the reasons for the Act of Parliament was perhaps for Henry to establish closer control over his household. Many of the members of his household had previously served Edward IV, and it may be that there were tensions between the former Yorkist members of the household and die-hard Lancastrians, which fermented in the years between 1485 and the Parliament of 1487. We know that perhaps 80 people were involved in this plot, and 4 members of Henry's household were actually hanged on Tower Hill for their involvement in these plots. The plot of 1487 is very mysterious, but the plot that occurred 8 years later in 1495 is much better documented and I think posed a much more serious threat to Henry's kingship. In 1495, the 2 leading members of his household, Sir William Stanley, the King's Chamberlain, who was in charge of the King's household above stairs, that is, the men who actually waited on the King, the knights and esquires who stood guard over him. The other man implicated in the plot was the steward of the household, Sir John Radcliffe, Lord Fitzwalter. Fitzwalter was in charge of the household below stairs, the cooks, the cleaning staff, the laundry, the stables, all those servants who actually made the household function on a day-to-day basis. Both Stanley and Fitzwalter had prospered under Edward IV, and their loyalty to Henry VII was always perhaps a little ambiguous. In 1493, rumours emerged of plots between Stanley and another member of the household and former servant of Edward IV, Sir William Clifford. Clifford turned, if you like, King's evidence and acted as a spy for Henry, informing the King on the activities of Stanley and other members of the household whose loyalty was questionable.